We've got an extra. It's a ridiculous room. And we are not projecting anything. Sure. I don't know. I'm having connectivity issues. No, I'm okay. Yes. That looks promising. It's about that time, isn't it? You ready? Good. All right, let's get rolling. Blue sheets are out and about. If you are here for Gendispatch, you are in the right place. We have Ben taking notes in. Are you taking notes in Etherpad? If anybody would like to join Ben in Etherpad, that I'm sure he would be thrilled to have the help. Murray is back there doing jabber scribing and relaying. If anyone wants to join Murray in the jabber room, I'm sure he would appreciate it. And blue sheets are going around. And if you are in the back and actually plan to talk, come to the front. And if not, well, fine, just play in the back. All right, all of the appropriate information is up on the screen. And oh, and look at that, we have magic button and everything. It's early in the week, but everybody in here, I expect, should know how to note well the note well. Please do make sure that you understand that minutes are being taken, the meeting is being recorded, and your presence is logged on the blue sheets. And if you have any issues with intellectual property and any of the things that are being discussed today, you probably want to read up on the rules and check with a lawyer. Why would there, yeah. Do we have any agenda bashing to do? Any additions or subtractions? I know Martin said he was running around doing one thing, and so we may need to shuffle him to the end of the agenda, but anything else need to be changed? So the only thing I think we wanted to say up front is, you know, this is generally like most other dispatch groups. We're trying to figure out what to do with the documents that are being presented, whether they need to go to a BOF and or whether they need to go away, or whether they need to just have an AD sponsor them, or what have you. So we're trying to get enough information out of the proposals to understand which one of those things it is. We're not trying to argue the proposals in here. And then we're going to, at the end, make a recommendation to Alyssa or whoever else might be involved about what to do there. Anything else you wanted? So, Joel, why don't you float up and give us your dog and/or pony show?
Hello, I'm Joel Halpern. This is a very short draft. And in fact, I did not make any slides for it as it seemed pointless. The slides would be longer than the draft. So the history is very simple. The relevant piece of history, our history as a whole is not simple, but the relevant pieces of history are very simple. RFC 2026 says you can that the RFC editor can publish informational and experimental drafts which do not have IETF consensus, rough consensus. I'm paraphrasing. Which, when 2026 was written, was absolutely necessary because there were no streams. So that covered IAB documents, it covered IRTF documents, it covered the things that John Postel published, which are now independent stream documents. The IESG has, for understandable reasons, interpreted this to say the IESG can publish informational and experimental RFCs in the IETF stream without having IETF rough consensus. They have done this and recently proposed to do so, and AD proposed to do so again, which is what caused me to go, huh? Because that just makes, the IETF stream is the IETF stream. It should be IETF rough consensus documents. So this one says simple update 2026 to say the IESG must not publish informational or experimental documents in the IETF stream without IETF rough consensus. And then it goes through and discusses the few corner cases we could think of. It does note in the very bottom that if this doesn't happen, the IAB should probably look at the boilerplate because the IAB owns the boilerplates. Because the boilerplate difference, it turns out, if you do take this path, is simply that the non-consensus document is missing the sentence that says there was consensus. Not exactly clear. But I consider that a minor issue because the right fix is dead simple, right there on the screen. So what I'd like is feedback from other people.
Hi, this is Barry Lieba. I'm the AD who Joel just mentioned. I didn't suggest that we should do it. I suggested that it was possible to do it, and I support this document. I think it is generally the policy right now that we do this, and I think making it casting it in stone is better.
Thank you, Philip.
Phil Hambaker. Yeah, I very much support this, having been the victim of it. There was an occasion where, at an early stage of what I believe to be an independent draft, I was told in no certain terms that my input was not wanted and I had no right to raise it. And that then became a draft, and it is now an RFC with IETF and standards track on it. And I was really, really pissed, as everybody knows, and I tried to appeal it and was not able to appeal it either. So I think that we should shut the door on this because it is not only open for abuse, it has been abused.
John, I think you're next.
John Peterson, I think this is a great idea, and we should figure out a way to advance this document.
But without consensus.
Can I make the suggestion from up here that part of the question was what method should we be using to do that, not just that it's a good idea? And thank you for, I got the irony of it.
Unsurprisingly, because I co-authored this with Joel, thank you, Joel, for doing the work. I'm in favor of this. As I read the Gendispatch process, the appropriate thing is to ask for this to be AD sponsored by the relevant AD, because this is like so trivial. I can't imagine what other process we would use for it.
If this takes anything other than AD sponsorship, something is confused. Ted.
Ted Hardy speaking. I am broadly in favor of this. I do believe that the document may need a slight revision to make it clear that what's the IETF has consensus about is, or rough consensus about, is to publish, not necessarily the content. Because you may be publishing something as experimental in particular with the results of the experiment, which you clearly have determined failed, and therefore we don't have consensus around the protocol, we have consensus to publish the results of the experiment. So I think there's a little bit of extra wording around that
Happy to have
necessary.
wording suggestions.
But other than that, I think it's generally speaking a good idea. And I agree with Ecker that this is probably something that AD sponsorship with a 4-week IETF last call list discussion would be appropriate.
Thank you.
John, you're up. John, you're up.
Hi, I think the principle here is correct. My guess is that this is the wrong way to do it. That it would be better to do this on the basis of saying of talking about the streams and talking about what's necessary for each stream, even if that's the IETF stream does X and other streams do Y, rather than enumerating the other ones. Stating this simply in terms of what the IETF must do just feels wrong to me. But I think the principle is correct. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that goes to after AD sponsorship. John is saying he's got suggested alternate text, is how I read his comment. And, but yeah.
I think it's a little bit more than alternate text. It's an alternate approach, but yes.
Okay.
Anything else?
So my read of what was said was we're pushing to AD sponsorship. Alyssa, do you want more guidance than that?
Alyssa Cooper, it would be useful to understand these alternative things that people have just spoken about. So getting a little bit of that feedback on the Gendispatch list would be good. And my other question is whether people think there's any specific subsets of the community that should become aware of this before it goes to IETF last call. Perhaps
Anybody?
the other stream managers. I mean, I can take care of that, but just thinking out loud. Just so they know.
I'm happy to take a task to do that as Gendispatch chair, but whatever you think is appropriate there.
I can do that. It's fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thanks, Joel. Is Martin here yet? Martin, are you here? Okay. Oh, then I'll do.
Let's invert the other two.
I'll switch mics. Switching microphones. So I'm speaking as the designated moderator of the discussion that we had. We had a virtual meeting about the eligibility discuss stuff. And so I'm going to give you the highlights. So next. We're basically talking about two events here. Draft Munasami Recall Rev was published. This is, for those who may not have read, about changing the eligibility requirements to be on a recall petition. So not the recall committee, not the NOMCOM, but the recall petition, the request to recall an AD. And the idea was to provide some enfranchisement for remote participants. That's the biggest change, is that remote participants would be able to sign a recall petition. The other thing it does is it reduces the number of people on a petition in order to start a recall. And this is about equity for remote participants more than anything else, and it's seen as a small step that could be done and rather than going into the big thing immediately could lead to other changes. So the eligibility discuss list was set up. There was some discussion about that, and then Ecker had proposed his document, which was more about addressing efficacy rather than equity, which is to say, the point of the second document is, look, the recall process does not work in general, and maybe the better way to approach this is to have a new recall process in which the members of the IESG, IAB, what have you, can petition within themselves to recall each other. I'm sorry? In place of.
I think Barry has a comment.
And a
Also-
comment from Barry? Yes?
Also clarifying the first bit, the first document also includes allowing iStar people to sign petitions.
Yes, that is correct. That
Which is different from what Ecker is proposing, but that
right.
it's also.
And Ecker,
part
did
of
you want to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let's not get too carried away in like the details of what Mike and I proposed. First is me and Mike St. John's,
Yes, sorry about that.
let's not get too carried away in the details of what we proposed, but I don't think it actually did replace. I think it augmented. I think we're just like, I think in our version, you could still do the ordinary recall procedure. We just think it's useless.
Okay.
But I mean, like, obviously if the community was like, do whatever we called it, expulsion and take away recall, I wouldn't object to that.
So, but I think one important point is that the position of that document is that the current procedure isn't working, and so let's try something that might work. To say that the draft Munasami might be just moving around deck chairs. So we had this virtual meeting. And next slide. So let me give you the high-level takeaways that I had as chairing this meeting. First of all, on the draft Rescorla, one of the concerns that was raised was that this introduces the possibility that it makes those bodies self-selecting, which was kind of the point of making the NOMCOM in the first place, was to not have self-selecting bodies, so maybe that was problematic. There was a general idea, and did you want to interrupt, Mark, or I can?
I just want to
either
ask a question of
Yeah, go ahead.
clarification. Mark Nottingham. I haven't been following this terribly closely, and I'm sorry for that. I've heard asserted a couple of times that the current process isn't working, and I don't know what that means because it hasn't been used in a long time.
That was kind of the point.
So unless we're kicking people out, it's not good enough, or?
Well, no, that even the times that it has been attempted, it never gets far enough because it's too difficult and unmanageable. That people, at least the proposal, the premise of the draft Rescorla was that part of the reason it's not used is because it can't be used, not just because we're happy with everybody who's on.
Because just not working, there are values embedded in that. I'd like to pull on those.
Yeah.
I guess the way I would phrase it is that there have been a number of situations in which people were like very dissatisfied with certain area directors, and they opted to just wait for the non-com cycle to roll, and that may be the right outcome, but then having a recall process isn't particularly helpful.
Sure, but again, there's values embedded in that. I mean, the fact that a few people in this community are unsatisfied with certain things that happen is utterly unsurprising to me, and I'd be concerned if we were in a state that wasn't like that. So, what are you optimizing for?
Yes, and I think, and this discussion was the open question of whether that was representative of there was not enough desire for a recall, and therefore the process worked, or yes, there really was what we think was enough desire for recall, but the process wasn't manageable. And we have to figure that out, but at least the idea of the second draft was on the premise that we're not getting there because the process is too heavy, and here's an alternative. That was the premise, whether or not it's true.
Yeah, I do kind of want to respond to you. I think maybe I just will hold off on that because I do kind of want to respond to you, but I think I'll just hold off. We can discuss it privately. I may be wrong, but I think there's a little more. I think you might find the position more persuasive. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ecker, did you want to say something?
I guess I'm not sure I exactly agree with the second bullet you have up there. I think there were certain people who thought this was worth addressing, and some who did not. I don't remember there being a consensus call, so I don't think we were.
Well, and again, my interpretation, listening, there were certainly people who did not think it was worth addressing. My gut and you know, it can be disagreed with, was that the general tenor was that yes, this was something that was interesting to address, and that some people thought it was not. But the general movement was, at least from my take, that direction. I was the one taking notes. I was the one listening for that. You can always choose to say I was wrong about that. Leslie, then Patrick. Patrick?
Patrick. Patrick McManus. I guess, given the invitation to say you're wrong about the takeaways, I'll support the you're wrong theory here. And I think it was a hard call to summarize. And that may actually be my top level bit, was that I didn't think there was a lot of consensus. I thought there were, you know, around a dozen different people and probably like 8 different schools of thought going on. And that was difficult. And there certainly wasn't a lot of agreement crosswise. The other important discussion I think we had that I think, you know, I would add to your list of top level takeaways is we had a discussion about sort of the cultural impacts of what recall means, both to the individuals and to the organization, which I thought was, you know, really sensitive and well done. And one of the conclusions I kind of made was that is a reason you see recalls not happening, is because they have a high cost with them along a number of different dimensions. And so the fact that it's not being used might not mean it's a problem. It might actually mean it's a choice.
Fair enough. Leslie?
Yeah, I think this, Leslie Daigle, Thinking Cat Enterprises. I think that sort of following on a bit from that, part of the challenge is, or maybe a better activity would be to try to categorize in cases where people have sort of, there has been some recall energy, trying to categorize what was the issue and how was it resolved. Was it really a failure of the recall process that we have, or was it that was the only mechanism in order to try to find redress for a perceived ill? But with that said, I would say that whatever we do going forward, I do think that a change to such a process that allows ISTAR folks to be involved in starting a recall is kind of an important step and independent of the previous thought, because sometimes there are cases where it is folk within the IB and or ISG and or IAOC who see the issues and they're not visible to the community, so they need to be able to act.
Right, and I want to say from my perspective, sort of listening to the conversation, and I don't want to, just to go back to Patrick for a second, I don't want to diminish that point that I thought was really important, that just going through a recall has certain impacts and certain really negative impacts depending on the purpose of the recall and how it's used. All of those issues, whether it's successful, whether it's usable, whether it has negative impacts, could in fact be separate from what the recall setup is and what it looks like. So if we want a petition to allow people from ISTAR, remote participants, whatever it is, it may be okay to leave the rest of the status quo as is. That it's still really hard to get people the gumption to get up and do that kind of recall thing. And it's why I sort of separated out equity as an issue. I didn't hear anyone say it's not a good idea for it to involve remote participants. What I heard was it doesn't necessarily improve things to make it easier to use. So, and I know those sound like weird, well, if it's not usable, why even bother going through it? But the idea being that equity might still be a useful thing to have in the process. Phil.
Yeah, I did at one point go through with lawyers working out how to use the recall and the appeals piece on a certain topic of great moment at the time. And the conclusion was that basically the recall mechanism is unworkable because it takes longer than the tenure of the office holder for a start. It would probably blow up the organization just trying. And if you were going to do it, I think that you would at least want to have people attend IETF meetings in person first to sort the thing out directly. And if you weren't making that sort of input, I just don't see what the, you know, I think that I think of all the things about the virtual participation, this is probably the very last thing that I would want to involve them in. Because I think that the type, you know, there are certain people who would use that capability that would be the worst people for using it.
And I think that goes to that last bullet item about people expressed a lot of concern about denial of service attacks by using the recall mechanism. I think the response to that was most salient was, remember that this is only the petition. So even and given the mechanism that was described in the document, which is you had to be registered remotely for 3 out of the last 5 meetings, it would take you at least a year to be able to get enough sock puppets to start just the petition, which could then be dismissed by a recall committee. So, but yes, it was definitely a concern that was raised. Alyssa, then Ted, and then John will be after that.
Alyssa Cooper. So on the call, just speaking as an individual with a particular perspective, on the call, I was musing a little bit about the extent to which there's some like shame involved in this process, and how some people who are, you know, in a position where they are not performing the role that they signed up for, can be in jeopardy of feeling this kind of shame. And, you know, how does the recall process or refinements to it like potentially exacerbate that? And I've been thinking in the time since then about like why my brain led me in that direction in the first place. And I think you know, a big reason for that is because in the last year, and especially in the last several months, the ISG and myself in particular have been working a lot and thinking a lot about conduct in the IETF and encouraging a more positive and friendly atmosphere. And I feel like that is a very pressing need, that, you know, that attention and that work is very pressing in the community. And it would be great to take some of the energy that's involved here in this and direct it at that. These might not necessarily be at cross purposes, but, you know, thinking through ways that we can support people who are in leadership positions who may be falling down, or, you know, ways that people can sort of gracefully move out of the process, as opposed to this, which is quite public and adversarial and all of these things. I feel like work in that direction would be more aligned with the overall sense that at least the ISG has heard from the community, that we want to be building, you know, a more kind of compassionate place that that is more welcoming to people. So it's just like a little bit of a tension that I see in that, like, if people are, you know, want to do something, like, can we put it into a more positive direction as opposed to this, which by its nature is kind of a pretty negative and divisive direction.
And one of the things, and I think it's a good point, one of the things that I think I saw, it was mostly in the Jabber chat, but I think it was brought up, was that I think what people have in mind by the kinds of recalls that were involved were not simply people who were failing to do, who were unable to do work or falling down in the job, as you described it, but people who were doing some sort of active harm, the people who were being abusive, and these, I think, are incidents that have not been recent. I think these are older incidents, but I think that's the kind of thing that people had in mind when they said, well, look, you know, the having to come up with 20 signatures and do all of this and not being able to get input from iStar, not being able to get input from remote participants, was very much about active malevolence rather than just inability to do the job, for whatever that's worth. Ted, and then John, and then...
We have a Jabber interrupt.
Oh, yeah, feel free to interrupt with the Jabber input there.
Very brief. It's Michael Tumim, who says he's a virtual participant here. He was sick, he got the flu, couldn't fly to Singapore, and is very grateful for the ability to participate virtually.
Thank you. Ted.
Ted Hardy speaking. I wanted to return to the question of how you would dispatch this.
Thank you.
I think it's very clear from the conversation up to now that AD sponsorship pretty much off the table because the level of consensus that seems to be emerging does not seem to support an immediate rush to a particular solution here. And I believe that leaves us with a BOF or dispatching to an existing working group, and I don't think there is such an existing working group. And as I was thinking about the potential of what such a birds of a feather session would look like, Phil got up and talked about remote participation, and I tend to agree with one of his comments, which is if we're going to have a BOF about equity for remote participation, starting with the positive aspects like serving on NomCom might be a more productive place to start than this. But what I was going to suggest is if we do want to move forward with this and did hold such a BOF, one of the primary purposes of that BOF would probably be to figure out how to scope the equity question in a way that supports the remote participants rather than focusing very narrowly on this. So I would prefer to see a BOF, but a BOF more broadly scoped in the ways that Phil and Alyssa's comments hinted might be better for the organization in the long term.
Yeah, and I think this goes to that question in the third bullet, and I think there was quite a bit, and what I heard was that was the real point of contention, was start small about remote participation in this particular way or go broader. So yeah, thank you.
So John.
Oh, John, sorry. Almost missed you.
Thanks for almost missing me. Three things quickly. The other thing which came up on the call relative to this fear about DOS attacks is that once upon a time, what it took to initiate a recall was for any single person without any qualifications or any previous anything to simply notify the ISAC president and CEO, and that was the equivalent of the petition process. Unless somebody's prepared to argue the IETF has become much more evil and has many more destructive trolls over time than we had back then, the statistical experience is that this just didn't happen. So perhaps, again, I'm paraphrasing what was said on the call, that concern is a little overblown, and it's one of the things which was not in your summary. Two other things. One of which is that while I agree about supporting people better, somebody who is trying to initiate this would be nuts not to try informal supporting mechanisms first, if only because of how long and painful this process is. And again, this goes back to whether the IETF has become appreciably more evil over the years rather than getting gradually better, which I think we certainly are. And finally, with regard to the BOF question, I'd remind people that when this draft was first posted, the discussion was about a BOF, and then there was a discussion about a virtual BOF and doing a virtual BOF soon. And for one reason or another, that dragged out for a very long time, and finally turned into this virtual meeting, which is fine, except that if we're now going back to saying we need a BOF and we need a BOF in Vancouver, whether that's the intention or not, the effect is to just keep dragging this out and dragging this out and dragging this out. And finally, with regard to the scoping question, one thing we should probably decide, however we decide to handle this, and maybe another a virtual BOF is the right way to do it, is whether the question about complete reforms of the recall procedure are part of that scope or not, or part of some other scope. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Hi, my name is Mike Hoy. I just wanted to amplify one of John's points. Pardon me?
Yeah, you have to eat the mic a little more.
Very good. Thank you. I just wanted to amplify one of John's points to point out that, as he mentions, large numbers of bad actors are relatively easy to come by these days. But I think it's worth noting that the cost of participating in this event remotely is $0. And so there is effectively no impediment to brigading this process at the moment. If we choose to do that differently, then there are ways to avoid that. But at the moment, I believe we should consider that as a viable part of the threat model.
Barry?
This is Barry Lieba. I started off, well, I do agree with Ted that addressing the broader issue of non-com eligibility and other things to enfranchise remote participants is more important than addressing this small piece. But I have been convinced that it is worth addressing this small piece as a way to get there. I think the irony of having a BOF in Vancouver that is for remote participants kind of goes without saying. And I think we're at a point where we could charter a working group directly with, at worst, another virtual meeting to discuss it. We have a mailing list and we should use that to start hammering out a charter. I agree that this is way beyond AD sponsorship and a working group is necessary. But I think the next step should be a working group, not a BOF at this point. And partly for what John's saying, that it's already been pushed out farther and farther. So the scoping should be done in a working group charter.
Ecker?
Yeah, Eric Scroll, I mean, obviously anybody can produce a charter and float it, but the reason this is getting pushed out is there's not actually consensus to do it. And so hence, like the discussion continues because there's discussion because of like, it's not like universal support for it. So, you know, we'll have to feel free to float that charter and then we can, I guess we can last call on the IETF list, but like, you know, that's not going to change the fundamental level of support.
Stephen.
It's Stephen Farrell. So at the risk of another current ISTAR member saying, don't just focus on recall, I think, to me, it makes much more sense if there's going to be a working group or a virtual BOF or whatever, for that to have broader scope on the equity issue. I agree with Alyssa about the, you know, expending energy on making it better for people who mostly participate remotely seems much more worthwhile to me. Sure, as part of that address recalls, but I'm not convinced, as Barry is, that the recall starting point is the best place.
One of the things that came up during the virtual meeting that I want to reiterate, I asked the question whether folks thought doing this would cause active damage rather than they didn't want to do it. There was some indication that people thought it would. You know, I would want to hear that fleshed out. One of the things that I think is important is people saying we don't want to do this is not sufficient to say there is not consensus to do it. People need to be saying there is going to be damage by doing this. And if the work can be done and people think that it is worth doing without some counter reason, if there is a sufficient constituency, it should go forward.
That's just your opinion, man. As in yours, I appreciate that is like the topic of a document you wrote, but that document did not itself have like any normative force. So there's no consensus on that interpretation of consensus.
I understand what you're saying, but there is no support in 2026 for, in order to charter a working group, there needs to be no objection to it.
That's a different statement from the one you just made.
I understand. Ted.
Ted Hardy. For what it's worth, I also agree that the way you stated that just a moment ago was problematic for any process document. We're not looking at something where the harm being described is something where we can, you know, point to packets on the wire or similar. What we're talking about here is equity, and determining the equity balance among individuals between the potential harm to them of going through a recall process or the potential lack of equity for being unable to respond to situations which require a recall is not something that's going to be easy to point to in the way that we can say your congestion control is going to damage the internet, especially for us. Let's be frank. Other people might be able to do a better job of making that balance of equity than this particular community. But I got up to say something else, and that is quite simply, I think the harm here is that if you start the discussion of equity here, it starts with a negative bias because it's around the question of who gets the right to accuse, not decide the results of the accusation, but who gets the right to accuse, rather than around the question of how do we empower people to participate. And I believe the harm in starting from that, rather than how do we empower people to participate, is the results will be narrow and unhelpful to the larger question, and they may harm that larger question depending on the result. So if you're looking for somebody to stand at the microphone and say, this scope is wrong, you need a BOF to get a better scope, here I am.
I appreciate it, and I believe that's what I've been hearing.
I'm going to cut the line here because we are a bit, yeah.
Colin Jennings. I would just like to highlight that the one of the concerns that comes up on this has been, effectively the sock puppet, those types of things. And we have seen that really happen. There was cases in WebRTC where there was very clear evidence that remote participants in a disingenuous and fake people and fake things tried to manipulate the consensus process. So I think that that's one of the things that people want to see something on. Now, that said, I don't really care about the recall process because I don't think it works, but I would love to see us having a better definition of membership in this organization than our current nom-com eligible definition. It's awful, right? So I would be happy to see us work on that for a more general set of purposes than just this stuff. But the difficulty is we're not hearing concrete proposals for what it would be that are gathering a lot of consensus, right? That's the problem. It's not that people don't wish we had one. It's that the proposals look like they have a lot of problems. And this term equity, this is just a little side note. I can't put my finger on why the term equity to refer to the disenfranchisement of the remote people really grates me in the same way that third world countries grates me, but it does grate me. I wish we had a better term.
Interesting. Actually, let me ask a question before you disappear. So the first part of what you said, do I understand you to say you think that some sort of BOF, some sort of consensus building in order to figure out what needs to be done to get better participation and enfranchisement, pick your other term other than equity, is what we need to do next?
I think it would be great to have a better definition of what it means to be a member of this, how you become a member of this community than writing a certain size check 3 times out of 5. Right. That seems like an insane definition, but I can't think of a better one. Right. And so, coming up with one that's good. And look, we don't generally have BOFs on technical things unless somebody has some proposals that look like they'd probably work, right? Like if somebody says, I'd like a BOF on perpetual motion machines, we'll probably be like, well, when you bring us a viable proposal, we'll discuss it, but not before. So yeah, I'd be glad to see something like that happen. And I would encourage it to be for the broader thing than just the narrow recall, because I view the recall as not terribly important, but I have no objection to being used recall, right?
Thanks.
Mike Hoy again here. So for what it's worth, I think that what we're actually talking about here is the accessibility of the organization, right? The ability to reduce barriers to participation and the ability of new people to become involved in the IETF. I think that is a noble goal, particularly for remote people, remote participants of all stripes. But I do think that is a different conversation. It's a broader conversation, but more importantly, I think that starting that conversation experimentally is important. Finding new ways to make new parts of the organization more accessible is a valuable goal. I think that starting that process with what amounts to starting it in what amounts to a disciplinary part of the organization or a disciplinary process is a much riskier way with much more potential negative side effects, whose consequences will include, if it goes badly, an unwillingness to explore that further as an org than you would if you had it exploring in virtually any other part of the IETF process. So this is a noble goal to get to, but in order to drive accessibility and to drive participation in the organization, there are much safer and much more sort of net positive ways of driving that inclusivity than this or any disciplinary or administrative recall process.
Patrick, you get the last word.
Thanks. So I wanted to address the concept of active harm because you asked about it. And so I think, I think about this in two different ways with this proposal. One is the cultural side effects that we've been talking about, and I won't continue to identify those, but I think that's a big issue. But I think there's also a tactical side. When I talk with people about, malfeasance that they believe would, make someone eligible for the recall process, if you will, instead of eligible to sign for the recall process, there is a lot of disagreement amongst what really qualifies there. And this came through on the call as well. And for some people, this is, misrepresenting the organization or something, very, very high like that. And for some other people, it's really a disagreement with how they're doing their jobs. Sometimes actually the non-com is actually looking to create that dynamic. And it seems a little strange to, within the organization itself to balance concerns, right? And so there will be disagreements about how people choose to do their jobs. And there's a lot of discretion given to ISTAR about how individuals would go about those jobs. And that is something we are selecting them for both good and for bad. And to put a lot of emphasis on, recall as it intersects with disagreements about how that happens, I think is perhaps a tactical mistake for us to do at this point. From a very just dispatchy kind of question with respect to these two recall proposals, I think these should probably stop here, but we might still want to undertake the larger question of remote eligibility.
And I think that last bit is exactly what I was thinking, that the recommendation of this room is sounding like it's leaning toward if you're going to take on something like this, take on the question of remote participation, maybe membership, although that word has all sorts of implications, but enfranchisement, what have you, and BOF that. And maybe to be less ironic, virtually BOF it, but that's so far what I'm hearing is the recommendation of the room. Does anybody want to disagree with that?
Thumbs up.
All right, I see thumbs up in a couple of places.
Yeah. So,
All right, Martin, I believe you are next victim.
John, real quick.
Oh, John, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to express disagreement. I think this gets back to some things which were said on the call about how to parse this out, and there is, whether you call it an equity issue or something else, and I'd rather call it something else, there is a real issue with remote participants being able to protect themselves against harmful behavior that is differentially applied to remote participants. And that's a significant issue regardless of how often we predict it will come up or not come up. And that was the motivation for trying to do this as a first step. So just to record the disagreement. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Magic, isn't it?
So I have a draft. It's a bit of a trial balloon, simply because it's a little smaller than the last topic.
Well, it's why we meant to do you.
And this is, I think, an important question for this process to address, which is, look at that. So this is the proposal. It's about one page. It essentially proposes updating BCP 9
which is, the all-encompassing process that governs pretty much everything that we do here, with a very small change. It essentially just removes the paragraph. Because this notion that drafts expire, I think expired a long time ago itself. But I think that there's a bigger question here, which is that how do we run small things like this? I don't know the answer to that. We talked about having BOFs, but how would you make a change like this? This is almost a nonsensical change. And I would like to discuss it in the time that we have available, but I'm more interested in discussing this question right here. Who publishes this document? What is the constituency for a document like this? How do we decide what consensus is for something like this?
Leslie
Sorry, I went
Daigle.
meta. Leslie.
So you've posited that it's a small change. So your question about how do we make the changes because you think it's a small change?
I think it's a small change. Would you like to contest that point?
Well, I do actually, but I think that's kind of the point, that to answer this question, I think the first order of business is to make sure that there is a broader support for the notion of scope of change. I mean, in general, I agree. I think the expiration date probably makes little sense, but I do think that it makes sense in the context of understanding whether something is current or not, right? But that's whether it's, so it is a small change. It leads to a larger discussion of what are all the ways in which we use this tiny little detail.
And we started having some of that discussion on the list. And I think that started going somewhere fairly constructive.
Right. So, but to back out of having the constructive discussion, right, and to focus on your question here, I think the part of the answer to the question, not the totality of the answer to the question, is you have to have a public discussion, whether it's on a mailing list that you've indicated, whether Gendispatch can launch these things or whatever, right? But whatever the process is, there has to be general agreement about the size of change that is being undertaken before you have an answer to the whole question.
I think it was Eka next, and then Adam, then Ted. I'm not
So,
sure if that's correct.
I have an answer to your question, I think, which is we should form a working group, which would people can present small things like this, and then the working group can suggest that the AD sponsor them. And so fortunately, I have a time machine. I went back and did that in response to reading this deck. And so we have this working group. You were here. And so if people in this room are generally positive about it, then the AD should sponsor it. I am positive about it, and I think the AD should sponsor it.
Ted Hardy, and if Ecker has a time machine, I'd like to borrow it and fix some other things. Quantum Leap project in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I wanted to make a point here that other streams use the Internet Draft series, and in particular, the ISC and the IRTF both use it and may have different opinions on what this means. So I would suggest first that you make the meta discussion of whether this has to apply to all streams or not. If it doesn't have to apply to all streams, and I don't see a reason why it would, then you can make the decision for what the expiration time should be on a particular stream by a statement from the people who control that stream. So the IETF can say what the IETF is going to do, and that's fine. And they can build their tooling so that works.
This is specifically an IETF proposal.
Okay, and so if the proposal is only for internet drafts which are part of the IETF stream, now you have to be able to identify which internet drafts are for which stream. This is not necessarily clear from all such drafts to begin with, but we can work that. But I think at this point it becomes a question for the stream managers of that stream and their community to decide. So it doesn't need to be something that the IEB or that the other streams have to deal with, because their own documents and the series that emerges from internet drafts are unaffected. So to get to your point at that point, I think that means that the dispatch of this handily is limited to all of the things which it can dispatch to directly, because they're all within the IETF. It can be AD sponsorship or a working group within the IETF. You don't have to hand it to a different body.
Just to put myself in momentarily, your dutiful working group chairs here actually did a quick review because we saw this on the agenda, and there's more in 2026 and 2418 than you probably think needs to be fixed to accomplish this task than at first glance. There's several sections where it appears. So just to put that out there, that it's at least interesting, maybe not as hard as it might be, but
I'm not looking to apply a patch to those documents. I'm looking to say that the expiration is removed
Right.
rather than the patch. I think that's what we're talking about. I completely missed 2026 when I looked at it because I looked for all of the wrong search terms when I first went through.
So did I.
So you would say that they still expire, but the expiration is removed from the header of the draft.
Right. A number of ways you can cut this.
Stefan Wenger. On the substance of the draft, rather on the procedures, how to implement it or not. I've recently sat in deposition in a patent case where the plaintiff, with a straight face made the argument that expired internet drafts cannot be used as prior art arguments. And I'm not joking. I'm really not joking. Yeah. Keep that in mind. This is from that viewpoint, which is a business viewpoint, agreed. But from that viewpoint, it's a very good idea. Thank you.
David Skenazy, Google. Allow me to start by saying your choice of fonts is bad and you should feel bad.
What about the colors?
More seriously, I support this change for two reasons. The first one is, yes, for the reasons you cited, drafts shouldn't expire, and we keep finding more reasons why this is good. And the other one is for the meta discussion of, if we have some process questions in the IETF that we don't really know how to fix, I think this one is small and simple enough that it's a good way to prototype how do we go about fixing such things, and that's a good thing to do regardless of what the topic is.
So just to note for everybody, there are 6 people in the queue and 4 minutes left. So focusing on the dispatchy question would probably be most helpful, but we will go over a little if need be.
Alyssa Cooper, this is not going to help you with that, sorry. So I just wanted to raise a few related ideas that have come up in conversations about this in the last several years. So, people mentioned concern about the liveness of the draft and this being an indication of it being alive or dead or current or whatever. It turns out that there's ways to indicate that aren't related to a date, like saying current or active or dead, which you can actually mark in the data tracker, but not in the draft themselves. So there might be other bits of metadata that are actually like more semantically expressive than the expiration date and achieve some of the same ends. There's also been conversation about the fact that the expiration date is felt by some to be a forcing function to renew the draft, and one might consider either for the kind of active versus dead question, or for the forcing function that if authors find that helpful, then it can be up to them whether this appears or not in their own drafts. So it need not be uniform for all drafts in the repository. About this question here, I do think that any of the normal options would work. I don't think we need some special process other than either AD sponsorship or spinning up a working group. I'm not going to advise you about which one of those might be appropriate or not, but I think, especially if it involves updates to 2026 and 2418, normal process. Fine.
Hi, Stephen Farrell. So I don't really care about this change, but I'm not against it. Unless you end up with internet drafts following different rules for the different streams. So if you're going to make this change, just talk to the ISE and the RTF chair and make sure everybody is okay with doing it all over. I don't care what the process is, but ending up, I don't see any negative to this unless it means that we have like another screwy rule that applies differently to different streams, which I think with internet drafts is not the case today.
I think that's right. Yeah. Even though the boilerplate may not really apply in some of the other streams, they tend to attract it. Yeah.
Yeah. Phil Harmbaker, I support this change. To answer Alyssa's, the way that you can avoid the pressure is there's a Perl script. Just works every 6 months, put in cron tab. If people want to mark a draft as superseded, then the way to do it is to just put in another draft to say, this is blank, except, hey, go here. And of course, people could say, this is a really bad idea, don't do it. And if somebody does that, I'll buy them a pint.
So, John?
Yeah, I just want to put a stake in the ground for the dissenting parties as someone who didn't feel like it was a good idea for the IETF to make expired drafts even publicly available in an easy way. And this conversation confirms it. One of the things which makes a clear distinction between the RFC series as an archival record and the internet drafts is this notion of expiration. And it may not be terribly effective, and the boundary gets thinner and thinner, but removing expiration turns the internet drafts into archival documents, and people who are concerned that RFCs from different streams are being confused with the authority and wisdom of the IETF had better think about this one and the ability of any troll to post an internet draft before you make those internet drafts archival. Again, just wanted to get the dissenting view into the record. Thank you.
Colin?
My colleague on my left.
This difference is touching.
Colin James, I wouldn't want to see us spend a huge amount of time on this. The drafts, no matter what people wish or say, and I heard John's point, they don't expire. When you Google the name, they're there. They are used as archival documents in law cases all the time. I've heard the same argument made by things and seen every judge always instantly reject that. These are documents that do exist, and they are effectively archival. In the sense that you get them afterwards, and that's good. We use them, we refer to them, we could talk about when things happened, the timelines for when things happened. But like the fact that we would spin up a working group to spend time on discussing this, it just doesn't seem like the most important thing. I think this is your most epic troll ever.
Yeah, that's a big statement. Mark Nottingham. I like this. I think we should do this. I think this is the right thing to do because it aligns what we say with reality, which is something I always think we should do. However, I hear it being asserted that this is small and simple, and something in the back of my head says that you may have opened a portal to hell.
That's exactly my point of getting to this question as the primary focus of this discussion was that this is talking about making a change to BCP 9, which hasn't happened in a great many years.
Right. And specifically, people are talking about different streams, and let's face it, a large number of internet drafts are on no stream, or they change streams, or they change states multiple times. And so, we talk about consulting the community of people who use this. That's an incredibly amorphous thing. And oh my God, we're talking about representation of communities again, and we know where that goes. So just tread carefully.
Yeah.
No. But we are out of time.
I think, yeah, Alyssa would yell at us if we said, well, we don't know how to dispatch it because we're out of time. Ben exclaims that dispatch in art does that all the time. I'm looking at Alyssa for some sort of help here. I mean, I heard a lot of just handing this to an AD is probably not it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I guess I would be interested in your thoughts of whether there's anything you heard today that causes you to want to like spin a new version that is substantially different, or like any of these arguments sway you one way or the other.
So the one thing I did hear was Stephen's comment, which is make this apply to all streams equally. And that just means, I think, making sure that all of the different stream managers are on board with it as well.
But that might make it an IAB document, not an IETF document. And
at which point I'm happy to go talk to my esteemed colleagues at the IAB, but I certainly would want to have this run through the IETF as the primary consumer of these things.
And I will note for amusement's sake that your faithful chair made a comment in the Jabber room which made it seem like there might be some significant discussion in the IAB if you brought it to them.
Well, I would just observe that one can have conversations with stream leads without having process implications.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no question of that.
So the reason I came here and targeted this at the IETF is this is an IETF consensus document, or actually two of them, that are affected by the change. So this is, I think, the primary seat of the change, and I don't think it can go on the IB stream and become part of BCP 9 and 37. But we should, my view is I would need to go and talk to the stream managers for the other streams and simply say, would you have any objection to this? What sort of process would you like to see this go through? What sort of community input do you want to see before this goes forward? But I think its primary home is still.
Okay, so I'm hearing your suggestion is you're going to do footwork to talk to stream managers, and then maybe it comes back to a BOF or something to figure out how to handle these sorts of things in general?
I don't want to BOF this thing.
I know.
I think this is AD sponsorship, if anything, because that's the right level of energy that a change of this size requires. If we can't do something of this size to our processes when we have such what seems to be quite a large amount of support for the change, then I think that we're stuck with the processes that we had in the early 2000s, and that's not a great place to be. That's why I ran the trial balloon. This is really just a test to see what the process looks like.
John, do you have a sword for this knot?
Well, no, I mean, I just wanted actually to bring back MNOT's comment. And again, I think you obviously will need all kinds of buy-off from everyone in the community on this because there is no other process we have. But to MNOT's point, internet drafts are not a stream. They're not a stream. The products that get published by the stream managers are the stream. And internet drafts are this weird amorphous thing that is handled by the secretariat, right? And I agree, you're putting exactly the right question here because we don't know how to target something that is in this weird gray area. So I agree, this is an even more epic troll than our C++. Because
I want to remind the room that we are 7 minutes over now, and you know, people who want dinner might start chewing on arms.
Well, they can do that. I just happened to be reading the boilerplate on internet drafts, what people might familiarize themselves with. So the first, well, the second sentence, the first sentence of the second paragraph is internet drafts are working documents in the Internet Engineering Task Force. Then it does say other groups may distribute working documents in internet drafts, but then you will notice the copyright notice says IETF Trust. So, like, one might be forgiven the impression that all internet drafts, as a practical matter, that are published by our system are IETF documents of one kind or another.
John Mattsson, deciding whether internet drafts expire or having the expiry header in the drafts are very different things. There's some confusion here. And I cannot find in BCP 9 or 25 that the drafts should have an expiry header. So I think that needs to be specified somewhere else or not specified at all.
So curiously, I have looked into this question. Yes, the boilerplate and the question of expiry are separate notions. I want to attack the actual expiry notion and address the boilerplate as a consequence of that. And the IEB owns the boilerplate, despite the fact that the IETF trust owns the copyright on the documents with that boilerplate. So I think we'll be fine on that question.
You okay with this outcome, Alyssa?
So my understanding is that Martin is going to go talk to the stream managers about their level of comfort with this proposal. I think if any of them comes back and is like a total blocker, then it's probably not going anywhere. And otherwise, it sounds like maybe a little more discussion, refinement, but if there were a path for this, it would be AD sponsorship. Are you comfortable with that?
And just a note from the Jabber, John was writing that please talk to the RSC too.
Sure. On behalf of Martin, he can do that.
I don't have a problem with that. And Ben has just typed that, I believe. So there we believe it. Yes, Phil?
I do have an AOB item.
Quickly, and we will bring it to the
Okay,
list.
yeah, this
likely.
isn't going to be something that you can discuss here. We need to change note well. We need to add antitrust considerations to it. And I will be very happy to explain in private the circumstances that have made that essential. And
I would love to see a short little draft posted to the Gendispatch list, and I'm sure there will be a hearty discussion of it.
Well, the problem here is that this is going to have to be drafted by lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer.
Well,
I may look like one, but I'm not a lawyer.
You're welcome to draft something that says we need something that looks like such and so, whether or not it has sharp content in it. All right. Thank you all. Blue sheets, please make sure they make their way up. If you haven't signed one, please come to the front and do that. Howdy, sir. No, I took it. No, I took it with all the humor and